Oh boy, fellow sleuths, we have ourselves another banger. So hurry up and get your plate of cumin glazed ham and pile as much loose corn as you can on there, because it's time to break down episode 6, Attila. And we know a lot happened, but we're going to kick it off with Irv's not at all awkward dinner date with Burt and Fields, because what this scene may imply would really shake things up. And by that I mean, is Burt a bad guy? Because they sure as hell portray him like a Bond villain throughout the whole dinner. The all black clothing makes him disappear into the void, making him look like a disembodied head. And when he is lit, it comes from the fireplace behind him in the most ominous way possible, while he's talking about being for sure damned to hell for whatever he did. And was Fields right? Was Burt having dinner with his Lumen partner 20 years ago, 8 years before the official severed building was ever made public?
And now, since this is 1000% not a throwaway line, it seems likely that Burt has been working for or associated with Lumen for longer than he's leading on, and was that associated with Drummond? Did Burt discover that Irv was working with the Resistance and the dinner was just a distraction to get Irving out of the house so Drummond could actually break into Irv's place to see what he knows? And what about the pet name Attila, which is Germanic for father? We know they throw away that it was a Hun turned into Attila, but is there a chance that maybe 20 years ago Burt was the father of the severed ship, or at least part of the team that developed it? And that's why both Burt and Fields are so convinced that he is bound for hell, which, in a twist of fate, is the same reason he becomes severed in the long run. More specifically about Fields, though, he obviously cares very deeply about Burt, enough to try and save some piece of his soul to join him in the afterlife through the severance process. What happens to his relationship with Burt, and what appear to be his strong opinions about the severance process? Whether Burt's Innie and Irv shared vessels or not, Fields is now going to see him as forever unclean.
Forever unclean. Yeah, I felt pretty bad for Fields because this is a real gut punch. He took great comfort in believing what the priest told them about the innies and the afterlife. And now he had a version of his husband, despite what he did before, that he could spend eternity with, only to have the realization that that version would now want to spend forever with somebody else, and he thinks he'd be alone. Lastly, let's touch on the three paintings that are in Burt's house, which are all done by the same artist, Robert Springfells. The Anglo clown painting is displayed prominently right when they walk in the door, while the other two are a bit harder to spot, and while the artist never explained what his work meant, the duality of the clown clearly mirrors a theme of the show that who we are on the outside may hide who we are on the inside. And Milchick's mirror scene from earlier is a great example of this internal struggle, where we're seeing the physical effects that it's starting to have on him with those hand tremors. But again, he forces down how he really feels and then puts on the mask that everyone expects to see. Nevertheless, the production team's attention to detail in this part of the show is what makes it the masterpiece that it is, and they couldn't have picked a more on point artist to do that. He uses a recurring theme in his paintings of placing figures or objects from past eras into contemporary settings, and this creates a sense of anachronism, which is where elements are out of their proper time. And this juxtaposition of people, events, objects, phrases from different time periods is a perfect fit for the hodgepodge of technologies that we see in Kier.
Helena also has a fun little dinner interaction of her own at Zufu, the Chinese restaurant in town. Which, by the way, Zufu is the Chinese word for paternal grandfather. Fun fact. But here she tries to have a light-hearted and somewhat flirty conversation with her now ex-lover, who's also not Mark, and manages to make it super awkward. She starts by letting him know that she knows about him and his situation, including the loss of his wife, Hannah, which, calling her by the wrong name, we assume is just a way to make it seem like she's not as close to the situation as she really is. But now, why is she even at Zufu in the first place?
So while this may seem like a playful banter with her crush, it's worth noting that the dragons in the storefront are more than just cliche advertising. This design is actually called Two Dragons with Pearls and can symbolize fertility. So between the Zufu name and the dragon reference, we may be getting a hint that a new Egan is on the way. Also, her showing up unannounced when Mark is out in public could be her way of trying to lay the groundwork for a relationship between them on the outside, given that she might be pregnant. Because we get the impression that she was not joking when she said that Mark would be the first guy she brought home to meet her father, reminding us all that she has lived a very sheltered life up until she pretended to be Heliar. And one last factoid, the restaurant was established in 1927, which is the same year as the Shanghai Massacre in China, which may or may not be relevant, but with all the other references to battles and historical events we've seen in the show, it seemed worth a mention. Meanwhile, down on the severed floor, Seth is trying his damnedest to keep his deputy in line, to the point that maybe referring to tightening the leash last week was in response to Miss Huang and not the MDR team. Because she doesn't seem to be handling the MDR team at all, but she sure as hell is trying to handle Milchick. And this becomes even more evident when he leaves her to steward the floor while he goes off and does paperclip stuff. But the long cutscene of no work being done shows that she's doing very little stewarding. Which leads us to think that this is another opportunity that she's trying to set up to play saboteur for Milchick and his authority.
And while he's already suspicious of her childish follies, he still takes the time to address the feedback given during his monthly review by making sure all the papers are clipped in the appropriate direction, and he starts to simplify his vocabulary a bit. This may be a step further than we were expecting to go, but this is starting to form the theory that all of the severed floor managers were raised and trained from a young age, similar to Miss Huang. Seth and Miss Cobell could have begun their work on the severed floor to show that they are wintertide material. His repetitions of grow up and just grow may be partially him trying to beat this style of speaking into his brain, but also himself telling him to grow up as well. Managing at Lumen may be all he has ever known and was never given the chance to grow outside of the shadow of Kier. But why would they do this, you ask? Well, here's the theory on that as well. Before the chip was invented for Severance, the Egans would have had to indoctrinate people, and probably pretty young, so they're continuing to use that program on their severed management team so that they can uphold the handbook and the principles of Kier, whether they're on site or not, especially considering they may have to leave the building and handle situations such as firings and the OTCs.
Speaking of handling OTCs and interacting with Audis, I think we can all see where things with Dylan and Gretchen may be headed here. While he definitely still wants to help his MDR friends, his time with Gretchen has pushed them to the backseat. We can pretty safely assume that Gretchen prefers this version of Dylan over the one she has at home, and they may work together in some way to try to establish this Dylan G as the primary Dylan. Now, whether that is through reintegration or some type of unending OTC, it would change everything. And since Gretchen's award for Dispatcher of the Month is clearly in view this episode, her job could play a factor in this. Or, fun side theory, maybe since we know she works at night and Gemma's accident was at night, she may be knowingly or unknowingly involved in what happened to her.
And last, but most certainly not least, Mark is fighting for his life on his kitchen floor right now. The name of the next episode is Chikai Bardo, which, thanks to a very high amount of research done by Chris for the show From on MGM Plus, we here at the Sluice know that this is the moment of the beginning of death in Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Mark is most likely reaching that point as he's feeling the after effects of the reintegration process. However, could that be what's needed for Mark's brain to just align both consciousnesses? We already believe that sleeping is when the innies and outies have the thinnest barrier. So the edge of losing his life may be the push that Mark needs to fully integrate successfully.
And that'll wrap up this episode. As usual, we want to hear your thoughts, and if you have a topic that we did not cover, drop in the comments so we can discuss.
And if you like what we're doing, let us and the board, the algorithm, know by liking and subscribing. It helps out the channel, and we really appreciate it.
The board has concluded the call.
Until next time, stay sleuthy.